Hi Class T, it's time for the next few chapters of Mr. Penguin and the Fortress of Secrets by Alex T. Smith. Chapter 6, Knickers. What happened next was a bit of a blur. Mr. Penguin panicked and ran up and down the plain, shouting, "What'll we do? What'll we do?" Colin woke up, leapt onto Mr. Penguin's bow tie, and bopped him on the beak with a rolled-up woolly vest he'd found in a box somewhere. That calmed Mr. Penguin right down. But what were they going to do? Edith was right. They were about to crash. The engines were spluttering and the plane was hiccuping through the skies. Above, a treacherously jagged landscape. Huge mountains were looming ahead out of the dark night sky. There wasn't a moment to lose. And "Are there any parachutes on board?" cried Mr. Penguin. Colin skittered around the plane, looking in all the bags and boxes. "No," said his pad. Mr. Penguin's flippers started to quiver, and he racked his brain to think of something. No parachutes. But what about something they could use as a parachute? "Colin," said Mr. Penguin, straightening his bow tie, "where did you find that woolly vest you bopped me with?" "Over there," said Colin's pad. He pointed to a large box labelled "Consignment of luxury undergarments for Mademoiselle Natty Bloomer's Underwear Emporium. Knickers of distinction since 1743, 5th Avenue, Cityville." Mr. Penguin took a flying leap, landed in the box, and started flinging the contents over his shoulder. "What are you doing?" Mr. Penguin, Edith yelled as a pair of tights landed on her head. "We're going to crash at any moment." Mr. Penguin sat up inside the box and said, "Knickers." Edith pursed her lips and tutted. "Really, Mr. Penguin? I know we're about to smash into a mountain, but there's no need to use that sort of language." "No," interrupted Mr. Penguin. "Knickers. This box is full of vests and knickers. Really big ones too, look." He held out a giant pair of silky pants. They were enormous. Colin, Mr. Penguin, Edith and Gordon could have all fitted in one leg and still had enough room to hold a cocktail party. "Colin," said Mr. Penguin, "can you spin us some web?" "Of course," said Colin's pad firmly. "Good. Then I have a plan." In no time at all, the adventurers were standing by the door. Mr. Penguin pushed it open, and the entire cabin filled with rushing, roaring, icy cold air. The plane shook like jelly. The left wing clipped the side of one of the mountains, and great plumes of black smoke billowed into the night. Far below them, snowflakes swirled over rocky hills. "After 3, shouted Mr. Penguin. His little penguiny knees were knocking. 1, 2, 3, and they jumped out of the plane. 4 giant pairs of knickers unfolded above their heads, attached to them by fine but strong strands of web. Mr. Penguin's heart was hammering as the snow-covered mountain rushed to meet them. He glanced up just in time to see the plane hitting the rocks above them and exploding with a bang. As soon as I could walk, I started performing in my father's hypnotic stage shows in little theatres all around the country. The audiences loved me, the tiny child with the extraordinarily powerful gift. When I look back at old photographs, I can see why. I was so adorable with my rosy cheeks, my freckles, my gappy-toothed smile, and tiny stage outfits. I had audiences eaten out of my hands, sometimes for real. I often tricked people into believing they were ponies. I fed them sugar lumps on stage whilst the crowd roared with laughter. Word of my performances spread, and I was soon travelling to faraway lands to put on shows for the rich and famous. I'd hit the big time. Huge posters of me wearing my trademark dark sunglasses hung outside the biggest theatres in the world. Desperate fans waited outside with their autograph books everywhere I went. My name was in lights. I was a star. And that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7. Someone is missing. Mr. Penguin slowly opened his eyes. Everything was cold and silent and white. It took him several minutes, just lying there on his front, to realise that he'd landed in a deep snowdrift. His ears were full of ice, and he was knotted up in his giant knickers parachute. He sat up, untangled himself, and looked about. He discovered 3/4 of the way up a dark, dangerous, snow-covered mountain. All around him, sharp, jagged peaks jutted up into the inky sky, like gigantic shark fins. Further up the mountain, their plane was lying smashed and smoking. Mr. Penguin shuddered. What if he and his chums had been in it as it crashed into the rocks? The damage to his special adventurer's hat would have been dreadful. A voice wafting through the freezing air interrupted Mr. Penguin's thoughts. "Cooey! Mr. Penguin! Are you okay?" It was Edith. Mr. Penguin patted himself down with the flippers just to check. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" "Yes, I think so, although I can't find my bum bag." There was a brief pause, followed by some rustling and a very businesslike bit of cooing. "Oh, it's okay. Gordon's found it," Edith cried, delighted. "Well done, Gordon. We'll come and find you, Mr. P. Wait there." A couple of minutes later, Mr. Penguin, Edith, and Gordon were huddled and shivering together near the wreckage of the plane. Mr. Penguin was very worried. "I can't find Colin anywhere," he said. "You don't suppose," he gulped. "Now, Mr. Penguin, we won't have any talk like that," Edith said. "He'll be here somewhere. We just have to find him." She pushed up the sleeves of her now crumpled and grubby dinner jacket and started searching the tangled mess of metal, parcels and underwear that used to be their plane. Mr. Penguin joined in, wishing he hadn't eaten all of his emergency fish finger sandwiches already. Mr. Penguin thought that there was nothing better in times of great worry and confusion than the feeling of a nice, full tummy. Edith and Mr. Penguin looked through as much of the plane as they could, all the while calling out for Colin. Gordon helped by standing and blinking on Edith's head. But all the searching was no good. Colin was nowhere to be found. Mr. Penguin's best friend and number one assistant was well and truly lost, and they were stuck up a freezing mountain in the middle of nowhere. Mr. Penguin sighed deeply and plonked himself heavily on the ground. As soon as he landed, he felt a wiggling from the snow under his bottom. A notepad was thrust up into the air. On it was written, "Ouch." Mr. Penguin couldn't believe it. "Colin!" he gasped. "Is that you?" Scribbling sounds. "Yes, it is me." Next page. "You are sitting on me." Then, "Help!" And finally, in brackets, "Please." Mr. Penguin leapt up, his flippers suddenly a blur of digging action. Within seconds, Colin popped out of the snow like a cork from a champagne bottle. Mr. Penguin wiped ice from his friend's frozen monobrow. "Hooray!" hooted Mr. Penguin. "We're all back together again." He danced about in the snow in a very giddy fashion. He only stopped when Edith said, "But what's the plan now?" That burst Mr. Penguin's balloon. Rather, what were they going to do? They were lost, miles and miles and miles away from their home in Cityville. And Mr. Penguin thought, with a tummy grumble, miles away from his favourite sandwiches at the popular place 24-hour diner. He looked again at the smoking wreck of the plane and scratched his beak. "Can you fix it?" he asked Edith. Edith put her hands to her hips and let out a long, slow whistle. "Well," she said ponderously, "I could certainly have a go, but my spanner's in one of my anorak pockets back in Cityville." She rummaged around in her bum bag. "And there's only so much I can do with sticky tape," she said, brandishing a fresh roll. The four adventurers stood looking at their plane, each thinking bleak and bewildered thoughts. Then a muffled voice from behind them said, "Hello," and a small hand tapped Mr. Penguin on the shoulder. And that's the end of chapter 7. Time for chapter 8. A clockwork sleigh. Mr. Penguin yelped and nearly leapt out of his skin. "Shh!" hissed the shoulder tapper. "You'll start an avalanche." Mr. Penguin, Colin, Edith and Gordon whipped around to see who or what was speaking to them. They discovered 2 small humans, both bundled up in an extraordinary array of knitwear and standing knee-deep in the snow. "We've come to rescue you," said the boy human. He pulled his scarf away from his mouth with a glove-covered hand and grinned broadly. "We saw your plane crash into the mountain from our attic." The other human pushed back her bobble hat to reveal a shock of blonde hair and 2 rosy cheeks. "We were looking through our telescope," she said, "and making notes about the fortress." The boy elbowed her in the ribs and interrupted. "Making notes about the stars?" "Yeah, stars," said his sister loudly. Mr. Penguin decided they must be brother and sister because they looked so alike. "Were they twins?" "And we spotted your plane," she added. "We managed to escape before it crashed," Mr. Penguin said, finding his voice at last. "We used some big knickers as parachutes." The two children blinked and then said together, "A very good idea." "But you can't stay out here all night. You'll freeze to death," said the boy. "You should come back to our house." Mr. Penguin was goggle-eyed. "Is it safe?" he wondered. The children seemed very helpful, and he did always find it difficult not to trust someone in jazzy knitwear. He looked at Colin, who shrugged and held up his pad with a question mark on it. "Our village is just down there, look," said the girl, pointing down the slope. Now that some of the smoke from the crashed aeroplane had cleared, Mr. Penguin could see lots of little lights twinkling from the hodgepodge of buildings clinging to the side of the mountain. "Come on," cried the boy. "We live in a bakery, and there are warm beds and thick jumpers and as much piping hot cocoa as you can drink." There was no mention of fish finger sandwiches, but Mr. Penguin decided to wait until he knew the children better before bringing up that subject. As the adventuring gang followed the children through the snow, Mr. Penguin made sure that the stone was still in his satchel. It was, but it did now have a tiny crack on one side from the crash. Mr. Penguin hoped that Professor Stoutgirdle wouldn't notice it, and put the stone safely back in his bag. Are we walking all the way to the village?" asked Mr. Penguin, who suddenly found himself up to his bow tie in snow. Colin came to the rescue as always. "Of course not," cried the girl. "We're going to go in my clockwork sleigh." And suddenly, a curious contraption stood before them. It looked like the sort of sleigh Father Christmas rode in, but with no reindeer. Instead, its sides were made up of hundreds of cogs, wheels, and mechanical moving parts. The two children helped the adventurers into the machine and took their knees under a snuggly wool blanket. "My sister made this machine," said the boy proudly, as the girl busied herself turning an enormous metal key. "She's a whiz with anything mechanical. In the morning, she'll have a look at your plane and see if she can fix it." Mr. Penguin was just about to say thank you when the girl turned around in her seat and beamed at them. "Everyone ready?" she asked gleefully. They all nodded, and with the pull of a lever, the sleigh shuddered and began rising up into the air on great metal clockwork legs. To Mr. Penguin's disbelief, the sleigh started walking down the mountain through the thick, crunchy snow as easily as he could waddle around the streets of Cityville. And that's the end of chapter 8.